Welcome to the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, silly, strange, and sublime aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the go-to parent, aren't always accepted at work, among their friends, or in the community for what they're doing. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan. Our podcast is just one of the many things we produce each week at the Company of Dads. We have various features, including our popular Lead Dad of the Week. We have our community, both online and in person. But the one-stop shop for all of this is our newsletter, The Dad. So sign up today at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. That's thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Today, my guest is Jeff Siegel, a health and wellness coach. He's on a mission to empower people to take better care of themselves and build a real relationship with their body. He holds a master's in mind and brain education from Harvard University, as well as a master's in Buddhist studies from Hong Kong University. He runs a private coaching practice for men who feel off their game and are struggling to find balance in creating healthy habits. Jeff also teaches mindfulness at Harvard and trains leaders to embody holistic well-being. Originally from Philadelphia, he now lives in Boston, somehow bridging two of the craziest sports towns in America. He's a new dad, and by new, I mean brand new, like 10-week-old son, Asher. And his wife, Claire, works as an HR director for a company in Boston. Jeff, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really, really grateful for all the work that you're doing and excited to get to share, something that I hope is helpful for everybody listening.
I thank you. I lived in New York before living in Connecticut, and we had a little sojourn in Boston where we lived in Boston for 2 years. Will you promise me that at some point during our conversation, you'll start the answer, when I was at Harvard? Okay.
I will see if I can, casually slip that in. Something, it's a card that I always don't feel comfortable playing because there is a lot of privilege and there is a lot of, expectations around that.
I'm just joshing. When we lived a couple of years in Beacon Hill, I remember meeting this guy in his 80s, and he literally said at one point, "Well, that reminds me of when I was at Harvard." I'm like, "You haven't been in Harvard in like 60 years. Like, I don't even know. Like, I don't remember that well what I was doing in college."
Paul, when I was at Harvard this morning, because I was there this morning teaching, actually, it was great. The spring flowers were popping. The campus had a certain energy to it. The semester is actually coming to a close pretty soon, and the anxiety, I think, for students of like what's next was kind of, starting to become a little more palpable. So
but
there you go.
Even the flowers at Harvard are high achieving flowers. Not a wilted bud there.
There's an underbelly of insecurity, self-doubt, and all sorts of other things that plague even the most beautiful flowers.
If that doesn't describe fatherhood right there, that underbelly of insecurity and self-doubt, I don't know what does. And one of the things that brought us together, as I read a piece that you wrote recently in Psychology Today that I really liked, and it talks about a lot of things. We're really going to go through many of them in our time together. But one thing that really struck out is your advocacy for men to be what you call a conscious dad. So let's just kick it. What does it mean? What does it mean to be a conscious dad?
Yeah, I thought about this term a lot, and then you've been using the word kind of, lead dad. I've used the term conscious dad, or kind of a mindful manhood, or what does it even mean to be sort of like a modern father? And for me, it was really trying to figure out, how do I reconcile these tensions between sort of these more traditional forms of masculinity that maybe older generations embodied, maybe even our own parents, and then more of the kind of progressive, in terms of things that are changing in society around gender norms, job roles, around childcare, and just, and then coming back to my own heart of like, how do I want to show up for my child, and what kind of role do I want to play in his life, and how can I role model that? So for me, the term conscious dad was really just trying to be conscious of all of these forces and factors at play, both systemically, culturally, and personally, and to try to hold them skillfully, which is not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's never easy to be a dad. There are lots of, as you say, systemic, or I would call societal forces that expect men to behave a certain way as dads. But you know, you're very fortunate. You're at the very beginning of your journey as a dad. If you're talking to a dad who's 10, 15, maybe 20, 25 years into it, and they want to be a more conscious dad, what advice do you have for them? How do they go about doing it?
Yeah. Well, I think everything begins with a dose of honesty, honest self-awareness, which, you can develop on your own, which is really helpful to have other people reflect back to you. Um, but it's, taking a look at yourself and saying, are you living up to your own ideals, values, around what it means to be a father? And a lot of times, we inherit all of these things, right? We're constantly
Yeah.
absorbing all of these messages from their culture about what does it mean to be a dad? What does it mean to be a good dad? Uh, and so just, asking, well, like, is this actually my value, or is this just something that was handed to me? Does this fit in my context, in my family, or am I just acting out this role because this is the thing that I see being acted out over and over and over again everywhere else I look? And so that's when we start to become more and more conscious of ourselves and our own patterns, and we can, we begin the work internally. It's the inner work then turns into the outer work.
Yeah, but there's a lot of noise out there. We've done some work at the company Dads with Equimundo, which is this amazing global organization that's trying to redefine, masculinity, and they've worked with the Gina Davis Institute, which does an awful lot about how people get presented in television and film. They did a report
Mm-hmm.
together that talked about the representation of fathers on TV, and it's horrible. You have the you have the angry dad, you have the clueless dad, the bumbling dad. You don't really
Mm-hmm.
have a sort of fully fleshed out formed dad. Dads are either scary or they're played for laughs, and that's what we're getting. And as you said, you inherit. We all inherit a lot of things, good and bad, from our own fathers or grandfathers. How do you help people cut through those messages, those stereotypes that may not be the best ones for them if they want to be a conscious dad? How do you help them cut through that to be, not a perfect dad, but just a really engaged, quality dad, a conscious dad, as you would say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, to your point, there is a lot of sort of one note depictions of what it means to be a father, right? And I see all of these in the ways in which these roles and scripts, right, are limiting who we can be, right, as fathers, as men, as human beings. And my goal is to try to deconstruct that, to allow people to be more of whatever they choose to be and more of what's most aligned with what feels right for them inside. And so your question of like, well, how do you help that? I think, and this, of course, I'm very biased towards a sort of mindful and contemplative bent, but I think slowing down and actually listening to your heart, being able to begin to calm down some of that noise. Again, it's like we're being bombarded by so many media messages and emails and technology. It's like we need to begin to kind of create enough space to let that settle so we can actually begin to listen to the wisdom that's inside of ourselves. I do believe that if you slow down and you can learn how to listen, you can reconnect with your body, if you can learn how to pay attention to some of those things, then you can begin to pick up on these little signals of like, oh, this thing that I've been doing like actually doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really subtle, sometimes it's really obvious. It's like, this is causing me a lot of stress, this is causing a lot of frustration, maybe this is like, completely destroying my relationship. Sometimes it's really obvious what's not working, other times it's not so obvious, or you let it get to a point where like things like start to really blow up. Ideally you want to try to get there ahead of time, but it's like if you can pay attention, you can take responsibility for the things that aren't working, you can begin to adjust them.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I was in graduate school, not at Harvard, when I was in grad school, at the University of Chicago, so out there in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember early on, I would meet these people and I could see it, like they were so amped up and they would keep making the same mistake again and again. And I kind of equated it to it's like walking naked into a pricker bush. If you happen to do that once, it's wildly painful. I've never done it personally, don't worry. But logically you wouldn't do it again. But metaphorically, they kept doing this. They kept walking naked into the pricker bush again and again and again. And as a dad, one of the things I've tried to do is only make a mistake once, not to keep repeating it again and again. Now, have I always succeeded at that? No, I just did some just the other day, and I was like, okay, it only took me about 30 tries before I figured out that this wasn't working. But if people aren't hearing that inner voice, if they're not, naturally contemplative, if they didn't grow up in a household where
Hmm.
contemplating your own actions was something that people did or talked about, how can you help them get to that point where they can become more of a conscious dad and be a better parent and happier?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love this image of somebody walking into a thorn bush over and over. And it's like we all do this in different ways. We keep repeating the same mistakes. And this has to do with our conditioning, with our upbringing, with our fears, with our traumas, the things we've inherited. It's like we all have that baggage. And this is work not only around being a dad, but just as you said, being a healthier and happier human being. It goes into, it's like, how do we work with these patterns that show up again and again? And I love what you're saying about, it's like, well, once I'm aware that I'm making a mistake, or I'm doing something that's not ideal, I'm promise to try to do it differently, right? So it's like, once you know better, do better, as the saying goes.
Mm.
One thing that I find to be really helpful is what I would call mirror work. And this is not a practice that I created, but essentially it's like every morning when you get up, when you are standing in the mirror, washing your face, brushing your teeth, you pause, right? Actually look at yourself and you say your name, right? And you say, Jeff, I am proud of you for, you know, blah, 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 right? Jeff, I am proud of you for, waking up today and getting dressed and going out there, right? So as you say a couple of things I'm proud of you for, and you say, Jeff, I forgive you for, right? I forgive you
Mm.
for not being a perfect father, right? I forgive you for, the stupid things that you said to your partner last night, right? But then the last thing, I think this is one is so important, is like, Jeff, I commit to you, right? That I'm gonna do better, that I'm not gonna say those things again, that I'm gonna have more awareness, that I'm gonna have more right ability to show up in the way that I want to. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like just doing that, actually seeing yourself, saying that to yourself in the mirror is like just sort of an opportunity to set those intentions. Right. And this is where I believe it's like you have your own best wisdom, but we often don't give ourselves the opportunity to actually share it.
Yeah. I love that. I can see how it would work. I mean, what are some of the roadblocks though? What are some of the roadblocks that get away in the way of men who want to become conscious? I mean, no man wants to be a shitty father,
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the roadblocks that get in the way of the best intentioned,
Yeah.
man from becoming a conscious dad?
I mean, there's a bunch. Actually, I wrote a different article on psychology today about what I, some of the classic man box mindsets that I think keep guys, kind of really trapped and feeling stuck when it comes to taking care of themselves. But one thing that I point to in the article is this idea of kind of heroic individualism that is really, part of the American cultural narrative. But I think it's easy for dads, especially, to get caught up in this sort of like, I'm going to be, if I want to be a good dad, then I'm going to be the superhero dad, right? I'm going to grow some wings and I'm going to fly and I'm going to be able to, change diapers and clean the house and cook the dinner and then take care of my partner and take care of my kid and still make all the money I need to make and have all the friends I
Yeah.
need to have, right? And it's like, well, hold on a second, like, is that actually possible? Are you setting yourself up for failure? And are you actually disempowering your partner, right, from having some agency because this sort of sets up like, oh, if you're the hero, then they must be the victim, and I think this creates these
Mm.
sort of these this not the it's not the right sort of mindset that you want to have, right? So it can lead to new dads feeling really burnt out and overextended, taking on too much, trying to be this hero, trying to do everything on their own. Another really common narrative for men is like, I got this, right? I can handle this, I can do this on my own.
Yeah.
Like, and like, yeah, like I support, like, yes, like, I support people developing that strength and that autonomy, and we need others. Like, it's more so than ever. A lot of this comes back to having community and support. And this is, again, I think the idea of the company of dads is so, so critical, right? To link up with other fathers that are also, going through this together, to talk about it, because it can feel so isolating
Sure.
when you're at home, struggling with your child, you feel like, oh my God, like, how can I handle this all by myself? And the reality is, for most of human history, like, that's not the way it went. Like, we weren't designed to do this alone. We're
Mhm.
designed to do this in the company of others.
And you talk about, the dads not being heroes. I think you said that you shouldn't aspire to be a hero. You should aspire to be a gracious human. Is that correct? I remember that part. Yeah. Which is another
Yes.
beautiful phrase, conscious dad, a gracious human. But you reference, the term man box. It often gets bandied around for people who don't know it. It's, these are the certain things that you were sort of expected to do, societal expectations as a man. But when you think about how does the concept of breadwinner and that link between money and masculinity and the notion in vast parts of America that if your wife out earned you, which happens today in about half the cases, wives earn as much or more than husbands. If your wife out earned you, that's somehow emasculating, and that's a trope that is a hard one to break. How can we, you know, either ignore it, the one, but two, as a society, work toward changing that gendered and fairly offensive trope that's out
Hmm.
there.
Yeah. It's a wonderful question of beginning to, you know, untangle this relationship that we have between, men as breadwinner, men as provider, right? Specifically financial provider. And, again, if you look back in history 50, 100, years ago, like, because of women not being in the workplace and all sorts of other things like that, that was kind of what worked. And now there's so many more opportunities. For full transparency, yeah, my wife earns much more than I do. And I am so happy and grateful and supportive of her going out and having a career that brings her satisfaction and joy and lets her use different parts of her brain. And to your point, it's like, all right, so, like, how do I integrate that? And so on one hand, I can just sort of ignore anybody who says, oh, Jeff, you're sort of lesser than because you're not the breadwinner. I think you do need to put up a little bit of a boundary, right? There's a healthy boundary there of, like, what you're allowing in,
Mm,
and if and there's always going to be negativity. There's always going to be haters. There's always going to be people that don't agree. Um, and that's okay, and I'm confident enough in myself to be able to work with that. I think the idea that, there's so many ways to provide and protect, right? Like, if the idea of, like, a healthy form of masculinity still engenders a certain amount of, protection and providing, like, does finances and work and, like, have to be the only way in which you can do that? And I think this is where we can see, like, if you get overly attached, and this is a trap again for men to get overly attached to their job as their, like, sole source of value or
yeah.
worth in the family, right? And it's like, well, if I'm doing my job and I'm earning money, then I have some value and everything is okay, right? Um, but if I'm not earning a lot of money, well, then I don't know who I am as a person, And again, then I think this is, that our culture, kind of pounds this message into us in all sorts of subtle and implicit ways.
Hmm.
And again, I want to be clear that, if you decide within the context of your relationship that, you as the father being the primary financial provider is what works, then great. Like, I'm not, there's absolutely nothing wrong with
Yeah.
that setup, but it's feeling like that is the only option, right? Is when it becomes an issue, right? And this is what is being a conscious dad is saying, well, you know what? Actually, there's some choice. We have, it comes back to agency here for both you and I'm assuming, like, if you're in a relationship, if you have a partner, like, for you and your partner, like, how does that play out?
Yeah, I mean, there are many reasons I started the company of dads, but one of them is I have three daughters, and I want them when they grow up to live in a world where they can choose what they want to be, and if they want to, if they end up marrying or even getting married, but if they marry somebody who's a lead dad, that's awesome. If they choose to be the lead mom, that's awesome too. But I want it to be a conscious decision for them. I don't want it to be something that is just the expected because they're girls who are going to be women who may one day be moms. um you also talked about something, and we said at the top of this that you're 10 weeks into being a father of a living being, but of course your
Hmm.
wife was pregnant for 9 months before that, so you were sort of a father in as her partner. One of the things you talked about that is a term I also found intriguing, for to really encapsulate a lot in a mere 2 words, and that's postpartum disorientation for men. And you talk about, I don't want to say it's not a way to walk through it, but explain that term a bit to the listeners before we delve into it a bit more.
Hmm. Postpartum disorientation, right, is the state of confusion that arises when some of your old familiar roles, who you were, before you became a parent, are kind of dissolving and falling apart. Yet this new role of you as a father is not yet fully formed. Right. So it's a period of transition, and there's a lot of ambiguity and there's a lot of uncertainty, and compounded by a lot of sleeplessness, right? And the other, just like the actual stressors of, having a newborn in the household, and doing things that you've never done before, right? There's, this is incredible amount of learning on the job. And so I was trying to find the right word for this, and disorienting really just sort of seemed to capture it all, right? Because it's like, there's something happening, and it's happening all the time at every hour of the day and of the night. And it was like, I remember coming home from the hospital with our baby boy, and it's like, we've been living in this house for years, but yet it felt new, in a certain way. And, especially when it was 3 a.m. and he's crying and you're trying to figure out what to do, right? It's like you're in a familiar space, yet you're feeling disoriented in that because you haven't still gotten your bearings. And so I was just trying to name that, because I think it's a difficult transition period. And again, I don't want men to feel alone in that. And I also don't want to minimize the incredible journey that women go on, both through the entire pregnancy, the miraculous nature of labor and delivery, and then everything that they go through. Postpartum is tremendously impactful on them and their bodies in so many ways. So I'm not at all trying to minimize that, but also just trying to give some voice to the journey that dads go on, again, because I think so many dads go on it alone, and that makes it so much harder.
Yeah, I'd also say, like, I think of three of my very close friends from high school. Of the four of us total, all of us, I think I was the last to begin to have children, and the one who went, you just don't know. Like, as a man, I think you don't know what it's going to be like to be a dad until you become a dad, and the natural inclination for men, as we socialize, is to kind of rib each other, talk a little nonsense to each other. And of course, now it's coming back and it's biting me in the ass because one of my best friends, his son just went off to college, and my youngest went off to kindergarten. So it's payback time. But that disorientation, particularly when this isn't even society, just some well-meaning friends are just coming over, and they don't even understand what you're going to. I think you talk about one part, grieving your sort of pre-father, pre-child self. What are some of the tips that you can give people? I think you had 3 or 4 in that piece. Some of the tips you give people to help them get through that postpartum
Yeah.
disorientation.
Well, I just want to back up and kind of comment on one thing you said before. I think you were talking about, yeah, some of your, guy friends sort of like giving you shit, right? Like kind of
Yeah.
trash talking a little bit, right? Like there's this competitiveness, there's this, um, like kind of like one-upsmanship, right? And there's been a lot of studies that like this is the way a lot of men communicate, especially in groups of other men, right? Where it's like this kind of this fight for dominance, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to say the thing that gets you better in truth, and and I think you said that's sort of like the natural inclination, but I argue like that's not really the natural inclination. That is the socialization effect of the ways in which we teach men from a very, very young age, teach little boys. I think it really begins at such a young age, and we do this unconsciously through all sort of implicit things, to like really begin to fight for power and fight for dominance. And you could make some arguments. There's testosterone and biological things at play here, which I think are certainly true, but I think a lot of it is definitely coming back to the culture piece. uh And so just, that's one thing, and to then you answer your question
Well,
on,
before you get to answer
yeah,
the
and
question,
feel free if you want to respond back,
no,
please,
no, I
but
have to just sort of point out to listeners once again. Jeff grew up in Philadelphia, went to college in Atlanta, and now also went to graduate school in Boston, lives outside of Boston. Three of the most intense testosterone-driven sports towns in America. So his calm, listeners, is well earned. But now you're going to give us the tips here, the ways that men can deal with postpartum disorientation when they have a group
yeah,
of friends who, as you said, and I don't disagree with you, who have been socialized to sort of, friendship is this needling of each other, this giving each other shit, as you said. But how do we get through that? How do we get through the
yeah,
disorientation?
you know. And again, I'm not against competition. I'm not against a little bit of, friendly jabs. As long as, again, it's held within a container of, like good friendship. There's a lot of
Yeah.
love there. There's a lot of trust there. I think that's really important. The sort of the punchline answer to your thing is community, as I'm saying. It's like, I think having connections with other people, and whether they are also dads, which is ideal or not, but that are willing to really listen and be there as supports is important. Some of the other things that I mentioned, though, is this idea of grieving, which I think is a difficult thing for a lot of men. We think of grieving as like this sort of sob fest. It's this highly demonstrative, emotional thing. And, maybe you allow yourself to do it for 10 minutes at, someone's funeral, but we don't really think of it in this broader sense of, every time we are, growing into something new, we're typically shedding or letting go of some past part of ourself, right? And maybe that's a form of our identity. Maybe that's something we used to do. Maybe we were part of like, a sports team that we can't play on anymore for a little bit because we have got a baby. Or maybe,
Mhm.
there was a younger part of yourself that always wanted to, stay up real late. And so like we need to let go of these earlier parts of ourselves to make space for this new father figure to emerge. And I think of that as sort of this birthing and dying process. And in that, this idea of grieving is really important. It's a way of just coming to terms with the letting go of what was, thanking it, thanking your previous self. Hey, thank you for all the things, you got me here. Everything that you have ever done, said, thought has brought me to this moment. So thank you. And, you're no longer needed, right? I actually need my energy and my attention now to be directed towards this
Yeah.
beautiful little human that I'm helping to take care of, right? So I don't might not have the time to do those things. So the grieving piece is important. Um, and then the other piece that I think I just want to highlight is the kind of the practice, right, which is sort of obvious, but like with a willingness to fail. All right, and I like can think of so many times in the last 10 weeks where I am like, wow, like I really effed that up, right? Like I really screwed that up, um,
Short of dropping the baby, you're going to be okay, Jeff. Short of dropping the baby, you're fine. The bar is
yeah,
really low and they're 10
you
weeks
know
old.
what? It was like day 6 or something. I was putting on the baby carrier for the very first time.
Oh, no.
I had him strapped in there, and and I'm pulling him out, and I'm just like, oh, this thing is great. And he starts to just fall for. I'm like, and then he is like halfway to the ground. I somehow miraculously catch him before he hits the ground. The best part was my wife somehow managed to be filming on video, so we had actually that moment captured. Like I was very close to my first major fail as a father. And now we can look back on it and laugh on it, of course. And of course, some failures, right, are a little bit more costly and a little bit more consequential. And keeping your child, safe and secure is essential. But also, like, so much of being a good father is learning to be a good partner, right? So it's like, in what ways am I failing my wife? Not showing up as the man that I want to be or as the way that I want to be. And a lot of times it goes back to I'm not being conscious, right? I'm running off of habit, right? And a lot of times the habits that I used to have no longer fit the situation that I'm in
Right.
now as a dad, right? And so it's like we need to update.
Yeah, I love it. Um, Jeff Siegel, thank you so much for being my guest today on the Company of Dads podcast. Always give the guest the last word. Any final thoughts? Any final tips to help the listeners be more conscious dads, or to just grow into being a dad?
Yeah. The question that I really like to ask is, um, you know, how will the dad I want to be do the thing I'm about to do.
Perfect.
How will the dad I want to be do the thing I'm about to do? And and this just kind of leads you into thinking what is possible here. And in that moment, can I rise to the occasion and step into that?
Excellent. Thank you again, Jeff. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for listening to the Company of Dads podcast. I also want to thank the people who make this podcast and everything else that we do at the Company of Dads possible. Helder Mira, who is our audio producer. Lindsay Decker, who handles all of our social media. Terry Brennan, who's helping us with the newsletter and audience acquisition. Emily Servin, who is our web maestro. And of course, Evan Roosevelt, who is working side by side with me in many of the things that we do here at the Company of Dads. It's a great team, and we're just trying to bring you the best in fatherhood. Remember, the one-stop shop for everything is our newsletter, The Dad. Sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Thank you again for listening.